The rain drummed softly against the massive glass windows of the luxurious five-star restaurant, where Daniel Vasquez, one of the country's most influential businessmen, was wrapping up yet another business dinner. Surrounded by bootlicking, executives and glasses of expensive imported wine, he felt nothing but boredom. The women who approached him were always the same, dazzled by his wealth and status, never by who he truly was. He'd lost count of how many pointless dates he'd had in the past few months, always with women who talked more about his money than anything else. It was exhausting. All he wanted was something real. On the other side of the restaurant, a young waitress maneuvered a tray with effortless grace, dodging chairs in her path. Elena Martinez had only been working there for a few months, but she already knew exactly the kind of clientele that place attracted. Suited men with deep pockets and oversized egos, sophisticated women who judged anyone who didn't match their status with a single glance. The man sitting at the central table, surrounded by business partners and investors, was no exception. Rich, powerful, untouchable. But unlike the other waitresses, she had no intention of impressing him. To her, Daniel Vasquez was just another customer. As Elena approached to clear the empty plates, Daniel finally noticed her. Unlike the women who usually flocked to him, she wasn't wearing expensive jewelry or flashy clothes. Her black uniform, contrasted with her sun-kissed skin, and her dark brown hair was pulled into a rushed bun, a few loose strands framing her delicate face. But it was her eyes that caught his attention instantly. Intense, determined, yet holding a mystery he couldn't quite figure out. "Anything else, sir?" Elena asked, her voice firm, not a trace of flattery. Daniel raised an eyebrow, surprised by her indifferent tone. He was used to admiring gazes and forced smiles. This woman didn't seem impressed by him at all. "A coffee." "Strong, no sugar," he replied, watching her closely. She nodded without hesitation and walked away to get his order. Daniel kept his eyes on her as she moved around the restaurant, attending to other tables with the same confident, distant posture. There was something about her, something different, something he couldn't ignore. Unlike the other waitresses, she didn't smile automatically at customers, didn't try to make unnecessary small talk. She seemed completely immune to the charm that so many others tried to use to catch the attention of the wealthy men who dined there. When Elena returned with his coffee, Daniel decided to push the conversation a little further. "You been working here long?" She placed the cup in front of him and met his gaze head-on. Her brown eyes held a sharp glint, as if analyzing every word that left his mouth. "Long enough?" she answered briefly, giving away nothing. "And do you like it?" Elena gave a small smile, but it wasn't one of warmth. It was the kind of smile that said she was being patient. "It's honest work," she replied, keeping it vague. Daniel felt intrigued. Most people would try to prolong the conversation, take the opportunity to get closer to him. But Elena? She didn't seem interested at all. And that only made him more curious. "You're not like the other people here," he observed, watching her reaction. She let out a soft, almost amused laugh. "Maybe that's because I'm not like the other people here," she replied, taking a step back. "Excuse me, I have other tables to get to." Daniel watched her walk away, feeling something he hadn't in a long time, genuine curiosity. Who was this woman who wasn't the least bit impressed by him? What was behind those enigmatic eyes? Meanwhile, Elena walked off, tray in hand, still feeling the weight of his gaze on her. What did he want? Was he just another bored millionaire looking for entertainment with someone he saw as beneath him? She sighed, shaking the thought away. She didn't have time for that. She had bills to pay, responsibilities to handle, and most importantly, a secret to keep. Back at his table, Daniel absently spun his coffee cup between his fingers, a small smirk forming on his lips. For the first time in a while, he felt challenged. And if there was one thing Daniel Vasquez could never resist, it was a challenge. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to find out more about that mysterious waitress. After all, he always got what he wanted. The next morning, Daniel Vasquez was still thinking about the waitress from the restaurant. It was rare for something, or someone, to stay on his mind for so long, but there was something about Elena Martinez that he couldn't ignore. The way she had treated him without any special deference, the way her eyes seemed to hide secrets. It intrigued him more than any multi-million-dollar transaction. As he sipped his morning coffee in his luxurious penthouse, his gaze wandered to the window overlooking the sprawling city below. His phone vibrated on the table. "Mr. Vasquez, the meeting with the investors has been confirmed for 10 o'clock, his assistant informed him. He responded with a simple, "Great," before hanging up. But instead of focusing on business, his mind drifted back to the restaurant. Driven by curiosity, he made an impulsive decision. He would go back. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, Elena was following her usual routine. With agile movements, she served coffee, took orders, and dodged the occasional inappropriate questions from some customers. However, her thoughts were elsewhere. Since the previous night, she had felt a strange unease, as if she had drawn unwanted attention. She knew who Daniel Vasquez was. Anyone in their right mind would. He was constantly on the covers of business and gossip magazines, the kind of man who lived in a world entirely different from hers. A world she had chosen not to belong to. Elena had never wanted the life of luxury and influence that her family possessed. The middle child of one of the wealthiest and most respected business families, she had grown up surrounded by privilege, but never felt like she truly belonged to that universe. Her older brother already held a high position in the family business, while her younger brother was beginning to follow the same path. But Elena wanted something different. Her dream was to open her own restaurant, to live a real life without flattery, far from the spotlight. To do that, she decided to start from scratch, refusing to use her last name to make things easier. She worked as a waitress while studying gastronomy, determined to earn recognition through her own effort and merit. When Daniel walked into the restaurant that morning, a shiver ran down Elena's spine. He shouldn't be there. The restaurant was frequented by businessmen at night, not in the morning. Her eyes met his for a brief moment before she forced herself to look away and continue working. This time, he didn't make any special requests. He simply sat at a discreet table and waited to be served. When Elena approached to take his order, he observed her with curiosity, but without the intensity of the previous night. "Good morning? Do you already know what you'd like?" she asked, keeping her tone professional. "Coffee, please, the same as yesterday." He responded casually without pressuring her. She nodded and soon returned with the drink. Without trying to engage her in conversation, Daniel simply thanked her and sipped his coffee in silence, watching the restaurant's movement. Elena noticed that he didn't seem to be there just to get her attention. It was as if he was merely enjoying the atmosphere, not rushing anything. In the following days, Daniel showed up more often. He always ordered coffee and, sometimes, a light dish from the menu. He never called for her directly, but Elena noticed that whenever she was in the dining area, he seemed to wait for her to serve him. At first, this made her suspicious, but over time, she began to see him as just another regular customer. Unlike the wealthy men she knew, Daniel didn't try to impress her with compliments or offers. He was simply there, and in a way, that intrigued her even more. Maybe it was just a whim, a passing habit that would soon fade. But for now, she just continued with her work, maintaining the same professional demeanor as always. One afternoon, when the restaurant was quieter, Daniel took the opportunity to break the ice a little. "You seem to really like this place," he commented casually when Elena brought his coffee. She raised an eyebrow, surprised by the lighter approach. "I do. Working here is part of my plans," she replied, keeping her answer concise. "Plans?" He tilted his head, interested. She hesitated for a moment. Normally, she didn't share her dreams with customers, but somehow the words slipped out before she could stop them. "I want to open my own restaurant someday. I'm studying for it," she said, trying not to show too much enthusiasm. Daniel gave a slight smile. He hadn't expected that answer, but he liked what he heard. Ambitious, and it makes sense. You seem like someone who likes to build things on her own, he remarked. Elena studied him for a moment. Usually, when she said that, people reacted differently. Some encouraged her, while others mocked the idea of her starting from scratch when she had an influential family that could open doors for her. But Daniel just seemed genuinely interested. She nodded, not prolonging the conversation. "Well, I hope you enjoy your meal," she said before walking away. Daniel continued watching her from afar. He knew she still kept her walls up between them, but that didn't discourage him. On the contrary, it only made him more determined to keep coming back to the restaurant and perhaps learn more about the woman who, somehow, had caught his attention. Elena, on the other hand, tried to ignore the fact that, little by little, she was starting to notice his presence more than she would have liked. In the following days, Elena tried to ignore the fact that Daniel Vasquez kept showing up at the restaurant. He always sat at the same table, ordered the same coffee, and maintained a discreet presence. Unlike the arrogant and persistent men she had encountered throughout her life, Daniel seemed patient. He didn't try to get her attention in an exaggerated way, nor did he pressure her into talking. He was just there, and that intrigued her more than she cared to admit. As much as she tried to convince herself that it was just a coincidence, the truth was that Daniel watched her with a veiled interest. He noticed the details, how she handled difficult customers, how she smiled at her coworkers, how her eyes lit up when she talked about gastronomy with the chef. Elena was different from the women he usually met in his social circles, and that difference attracted him more and more. One afternoon, when the restaurant was quieter, Elena felt she couldn't ignore it any longer. After serving Daniel, she took a deep breath and approached his table again. "You really like the coffee here, don't you?" she commented, crossing her arms. Daniel looked up at her, an amused smile on his lips. "I like the atmosphere," he replied casually. "And some of the people who work here." She narrowed her eyes, trying to decipher his intentions. But Daniel didn't seem to have any obvious ulterior motives. His gaze wasn't intrusive, his posture was relaxed. That disarmed her a little. "I'm not a big fan of frequent customers who ask personal questions," she said, keeping her distance. "Then why are you still here talking to me?" he countered with a smirk. She scoffed, crossing her arms. "Because I'm trying to figure out if you're just a bored man or if there's another reason for your insistence on coming here." Daniel held back a laugh. He liked her straightforwardness. "Maybe a little of both. But to be honest, I'm curious about you," he said sincerely. "You're not like the other people I know." Elena rolled her eyes. "I've heard that before. It's usually followed by an attempt to impress me with money or empty promises. I have no intention of impressing you with money. In fact, I get the feeling that none of that would impress you, would it?" Daniel tilted his head, as if analyzing her. She remained silent for a moment. The way he looked at her made her feel vulnerable, but at the same time, there was something genuine about him, something that made her lower her guard just a little. "You're right, it wouldn't impress me," she finally said. Daniel nodded, as if he had already expected that answer. "Then maybe I'll just keep coming here, drinking my coffee, and enjoying the good company whenever I'm allowed." She rolled her eyes again, but couldn't help a faint smile. In the following days, Daniel continued to frequent the restaurant, but he respected Elena's space. When she wanted to talk, he responded. When she preferred to keep her distance, he simply drank his coffee and left without forcing anything. Over time, Elena got used to his presence. She even started to notice when he didn't show up, and secretly, she missed his silent presence. One night, while closing the restaurant, one of Elena's co-workers commented, "That guy Daniel, he seems pretty interested in you. he said with an amused smile. Elena shook her head. He just likes the coffee, she replied, avoiding details. Sure. And that's why he looks at you like that, the coworker teased. She didn't answer, just shrugged and continued organizing things. But deep down, she knew there was something different about Daniel. Something that, no matter how hard she tried to avoid, was pulling her toward him. On a Saturday, Daniel showed up at the Tiu restaurant late at night, something he didn't often do. The place was already quieter, and Elena was at the counter organizing a few things when he approached. Was today a busy day? He asked, leaning on the counter. She looked up at him and nodded. Yeah, weekends are usually hectic. He watched her for a moment before speaking again. I have a question for you. If it's about my personal life, I'll warn you now that the answer will be short, she joked. He laughed. Actually, it's about food, he said, and that caught her attention. If you had to choose one dish to represent who you are, what would it be? Elena frowned, caught off guard by the unusual question. But after a moment, she smiled. A simple dish, but full of flavor. Maybe a handmade pasta, made with fresh ingredients, with no pretense of being luxurious, but something that makes anyone want to have seconds. Daniel smiled at her answer. I like that. It means you value what's genuine, without the need for excess. She looked at him, trying to figure out if he truly understood her way of seeing the world. And for the first time, she felt that maybe he did. Or at least, he was willing to try. And you? She asked, surprised at herself for returning the question. Daniel thought for a moment before answering. Maybe an aged wine. At first, it may seem ordinary, but over time, you realize there are many more layers than you expected. She raised an eyebrow, amused. Modest, huh? He chuckled. Just honest. Elena shook her head, still smiling, and went back to her work. But inside, she felt something different. As if for the first time, she was willing to let someone into her world. Even if just a little. As Daniel walked away, he realized that, without even noticing, he was getting exactly what he wanted, getting closer to Elena. But he knew there was still a long road ahead. And for the first time in a long time, he was willing to wait. Days passed, and Daniel's presence at the restaurant became something natural. Elena wasn't sure exactly when, but at some point, she stopped seeing him as just another customer and started seeing him as someone who genuinely enjoyed being there, not just because of her, but because of the atmosphere, the food, the warm environment she valued so much. And, against all her expectations, she started to enjoy his company. Unlike other men who had tried to get close to her, Daniel never asked invasive questions or tried to impress her with grand gestures. He was simply there, with his subtle observations and conversations that always made her think. But even so, Elena kept reminding herself why she had chosen to stay far away from the world he came from. One night, as the restaurant was about to close, Daniel walked in. He usually didn't come this late, which made her raise an eyebrow when she saw him. I thought you'd be home by now, already planning another strategic visit for tomorrow, she teased while wiping down the counter. Daniel smiled, taking a seat at his usual table. Today was a busy day. I figured a cup of coffee would help clear my mind, he replied, watching her. But if my presence bothers you, I can leave, Elena scoffed, rolling her eyes. You know you don't bother me. You just intrigue me. She brought his coffee over and leaned against the counter for a moment. Daniel held the cup but didn't drink right away. He looked hesitant, something she hadn't seen in him before. What is it? She asked, frowning. He hesitated for a second before answering. I wanted to invite you to dinner. She blinked, surprised. Dinner? Yes. But before you say no, let me be clear. I'm not asking you on a formal date. I just think it would be nice to talk somewhere other than this restaurant, in a place where you don't always have to be working. She narrowed her eyes. That sounds like a date, he smirked. And if it is, what's so wrong about that? Elena sighed and looked away. A part of her wanted to say yes, to know what it would be like to spend time with Daniel outside of this place. But another part of her remembered what he represented, a world she had chosen to leave behind. I don't know if that's a good idea, she murmured. Daniel didn't push. He simply nodded, as if he had already expected that response. That's okay, but if you change your mind, my invitation still stands. Elena felt a tightness in her chest when he accepted her refusal without questioning it. A part of her had expected him to insist, to try to convince her, but the way he respected her decision made her wonder if she was being too harsh. In the following days, Daniel continued coming to the restaurant, but never mentioned dinner again. He didn't seem bothered by her refusal, which, in a strange way, frustrated her. Why didn't he try again? Why didn't he insist like so many others would? One night, after closing up, Elena was leaving the restaurant when she saw Daniel across the street, talking on the phone. He looked serious, different from the relaxed man she was used to seeing inside. For a moment, she considered just walking away, but something made her hesitate. Before she could regret it, she crossed the street and stopped in front of him. Daniel looked up, surprised to see her there. Elena, what's wrong? She took a deep breath. About that dinner. Is the offer still on the table? A genuine smile spread across Daniel's lips, as if he had been waiting for this all along. Always. Tomorrow night. Does that work for you? She nodded slowly. It does. He didn't say anything else, just smiled and gave her a small nod, as if he didn't want to pressure her. Elena, on the other hand, felt her heart race. She wasn't sure if she was making the right choice, but something inside her told her that maybe, just maybe, it was time to take a chance. The night of the dinner arrived faster than Elena had expected. Even though she had been the one to make the decision to accept Daniel's invitation, a part of her still wasn't sure if she was ready for what it meant. It wasn't just a dinner. It was a step towards something she had been avoiding for a long time, allowing herself to feel. She chose a simple yet elegant dress that highlighted her natural beauty without being ostentatious. As she arrived at the restaurant Daniel had chosen, she felt a slight flutter in her stomach. It was a sophisticated place, but not overly extravagant, which surprised her. He could have taken her to one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, but he had opted for something more discreet. That made Elena feel a little more at ease. When he saw her, Daniel's face lit up with a genuine smile as he stood to greet her. "You came," he said, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She nodded, offering a small smile. "You invited me, didn't you?" Daniel chuckled softly and pulled out a chair for her. "Yes, but still, I'm glad you accepted." The dinner started off lighthearted. Daniel kept the conversation casual, asking about Elena's passion for gastronomy and what her favorite dishes were. With every answer she gave, he seemed even more intrigued, and that unsettled her. She was used to men who only pretended to care, but Daniel seemed genuinely fascinated by what she had to say. "What about you?" Elena asked after a while. "What was your dream before you became one of the most powerful men in the country?" Daniel smirked slightly, running his finger along the rim of his wine glass before replying. "I wanted to be a musician," he said, earning a surprised look from Elena. "But my father always made it clear that it wasn't an acceptable future for a Vasquez. So I ended up following the path of business." Elena tilted her head slightly, analyzing him. "Do you regret it?" He hesitated for a moment before shrugging. "Sometimes. I enjoy what I do, but there are times when I wonder if I could have chosen a different path." "So why didn't you?" Daniel smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile, because not everyone has the courage to defy expectations. Elena saw herself reflected in that answer. She had chosen a different path, far from her family's influence, and she knew how hard it was to carry that weight. For the first time, She felt like she understood Daniel on a deeper level. The dinner continued, and the connection between them grew stronger with each passing minute. The accidental brush of hands as they reached for the same bottle of wine, the exchanged glances when one finished the other's sentence. It was as if something invisible was pulling them toward each other. After dessert, Daniel suggested a walk. The restaurant was near a well-lit park, and the night air was cool. Elena agreed, and they walked side by side, the silence between them more comfortable than any words. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said, breaking the quiet. "Of course." He looked at her, as if trying to see beyond the surface. "Why do you never talk about your family?" Elena stopped for a brief moment, feeling her heart race. "Because I prefer to be known for who I am, not for the last name I carry," she finally answered. Daniel studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I understand." And for the first time, Elena had the feeling that he really did. They kept walking, and when they reached Elena's car, Daniel held the door open for her. "Thank you for tonight," he said, his eyes filled with something warm and sincere. "It was better than any business meeting I've ever had." Elena smiled, feeling an unexpected warmth in her chest. "I'm glad to hear that." For a moment, they just stood there, looking at each other. The air between them seemed to turn electric, the space between their bodies shrinking to just a few inches. Daniel raised his hand, gently tucking a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. "Good night, Elena," he said, his voice low and full of meaning. She felt her heart race, but she held herself back. She only smiled and got into the car. As she drove home, she realized she was still smiling. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she was ready for something new. That morning, Elena woke up feeling something she hadn't experienced in a long time, an unexpected lightness. The dinner with Daniel had been different from what she expected. He hadn't forced anything, hadn't tried to impress her with extravagance or empty speeches. He had simply been there, genuine, interested in getting to know her, and that left her intrigued. As she prepared her coffee, she caught herself smiling at the memory of the way he looked at her, with a mix of curiosity and respect. But she quickly shook her head, pushing those thoughts away. She couldn't allow herself to dive into this so easily, not when there were still so many barriers between them. At the restaurant, her routine went on as usual, but this time, when Daniel walked through the door, something changed. He was no longer just a frequent customer. He was no longer just a man who sipped his coffee while observing the movement around him. Now, there was something more. A silent understanding that lingered between them. He sat at his usual table and waited for her to come over. Elena walked toward him with steady steps, but she felt her heart subtly racing. "The usual?" she asked, keeping a professional expression, but noticing the amused glint in his eyes. "Maybe. But today, I feel like trying something different." "Any recommendations?" She arched an eyebrow, surprised. "Since when do you step out of your routine?" "Since I realized routines can be boring." He rested his chin on his hand, waiting. Elena sighed and for a moment forgot the customer waitress. Dynamic. She thought about the menu, about what could truly surprise him. Try the walnut tart with salted caramel. It's not on the main menu, but it's one of the best things we make here. Sounds like a great choice. He smiled. "I trust your taste." Elena nodded and walked away, feeling his gaze still on her. Heat rose to her face. When she returned with the dessert, Daniel took a bite and let out a satisfied sigh. "Amazing. I think you have a talent for recommending dishes." "It's part of my job." He looked directly at her, with that expression that made her feel both vulnerable and seen at the same time. "No, that's part of you." Elena swallowed hard and looked away. How did he always find the right words to break through her defenses? In the following days, Daniel's presence in the restaurant remained frequent, but something had subtly shifted. Now, Elena felt increasingly comfortable around him. They exchanged glances, small smiles, and she realized that, without meaning to, she spent more time at his table than at any other. It was on a rainy night that everything intensified. The restaurant was about to close when Daniel walked in, his hair slightly damp from the drizzle outside. Elena sighed, crossing her arms as he sat at his usual table. "Don't you have a home to go to?" she teased, trying to hide a smile. He chuckled, leaning back comfortably in his chair. "Maybe I got used to the coffee here, or the company." She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. She picked up a napkin and played with it on the counter while watching Daniel. "You know, I don't think I've ever seen you truly relaxed. You always seem like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." He raised an eyebrow. "Is that a professional analysis? Just an observation, but maybe you need some advice." "And what would that be?" She leaned slightly forward, her eyes shining with challenge. "Enjoy the little things, like right now, sitting here, having coffee, without needing to impress anyone." Daniel watched her for a moment, as if he wanted to remember this exact instant. Then, he gave a small smile. "With you, Elena, I never have to pretend." Her heart skipped an unexpected beat. Why did those words affect her so deeply? The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. On the contrary, the connection between them seemed to grow without the need for words. By the time the restaurant closed, the rain outside had intensified. Elena grabbed her bag and looked at Daniel, who was leaning against the glass door, watching the storm. "Looks like you'll have to wait a while before heading home," she said. He turned to her, a playful smile on his lips. "Or we can take advantage of the opportunity." Elena frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel took a step forward and held out his hand. "Let's go for a walk. In the rain." She blinked, surprised. "Are you crazy?" "Probably. But they say some crazy things are worth it." She looked at the rain, hesitant. But then she saw the way Daniel was watching her, with a glint of challenge and sincerity. Before she could overthink it, she grabbed his hand and stepped outside. Thinkfi. Rain poured over them, cold and intense. Elena let out an involuntary laugh as the drops soaked her hair, and Daniel laughed along with her, pulling her by the hand as they walked aimlessly down the sidewalk. It was reckless, but it was also freeing. And when Daniel gently twirled her around and pulled her closer, Elena realized she didn't want to run anymore. She wanted to feel. He cupped her face delicately, his fingers trailing along her damp skin. Daniel's eyes dropped to her lips, and for a moment, the world around them disappeared. Then, he kissed her. The kiss started soft, but quickly deepened into something more intense, more urgent. Elena's hands gripped his shoulders, pulling him closer, while Daniel explored every sensation with a mix of urgency and tenderness. The rain streamed down their faces, blending with the heat that grew between them. When they finally pulled away, both were breathless, their eyes glowing with desire and something more, something neither of them was ready to admit. That was inevitable. Daniel finished, smiling. Elena smiled back, knowing that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The rain had stopped, but Elena still felt her body warm, as if the cold drops had not been enough to extinguish the fire that Daniel's kiss had ignited within her. As they walked back to the restaurant, neither of them spoke. It was as if words were unnecessary at that moment. However, inside her, thoughts raced like a whirlwind. What had just happened? She had allowed herself, even if just for a moment, to dive into that feeling. Daniel made her feel things she had tried to avoid for so long. But was it right to continue with this? As soon as they arrived back at the restaurant, Elena turned to Daniel. Her hair clung to her skin from the humidity, and his intense gaze still burned into her. "Do we need to talk about this?" she asked, her voice lower than she had intended. Daniel smirked, as if he had already expected that question. "Only if you want to." She crossed her arms, trying to appear indifferent, but she knew her eyes betrayed her. "We can't just ignore what happened." "I don't want to ignore it, Elena." He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "But I also don't want to pressure you. If you want to pretend this never happened, I'll respect that." She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Her mind screamed for her to walk away, but her body wanted the exact opposite. Daniel wasn't like the other men who had tried to win her over. He didn't make empty promises or try to impress her with his wealth. That terrified her, because somehow he was stepping into her real world. "I need time," she murmured finally. Daniel nodded, not pushing further. Time granted, and with that, he stepped away, leaving Elena tangled in a web of conflicting emotions. In the following days, Elena tried to return to her routine. However, every time she saw Daniel walk into the restaurant, her heart skipped a beat. He acted as he always did, never forcing a conversation, but never stopping those glances that made her chest tighten. One afternoon, as she was organizing the silverware at the counter, one of her co-workers, Sophia, approached with a mischievous smile. "What's going on between you and the mysterious customer?" she asked, leaning on the counter. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Nothing. He's just a regular customer." Sophia laughed, clearly unconvinced. "Right. And I'm the Queen of England." She crossed her arms. "Elena, I've worked here long enough to know that no customer frequents this restaurant so often without a good reason." Elena sighed, feeling a slight warmth rise to her cheeks. "He's different, but I don't know if I want this." Sophia smiled. "Maybe it's not about wanting it, but needing it. Sometimes life gives us something we didn't even know we were looking for." Before Elena could respond, Daniel's voice sounded behind her. "Elena?" She turned quickly, caught off guard. Daniel was there, tall, confident, but with that gaze that made her tremble inside. "I need to talk to you. Can you step outside for a minute?" She glanced at Sophia, who raised her eyebrows, clearly entertained. With no other option, Elena removed her apron and followed Daniel outside the restaurant. The fresh night breeze brushed against her face, and she crossed her arms, waiting for him to speak first. "I'll get straight to the point," Daniel said, his eyes locked on hers. "I want to take you out. For real. No excuses or evasions. A real date." Elena's heart raced. "Daniel, before you say you need time, let me ask you something." He stepped a little closer. "Do you want this? Do you want to be with me?" Elena felt her breath hitch for a moment. She hadn't expected such a direct approach, but deep down, she knew the answer. She didn't want to keep running. She wanted to feel. She wanted to allow herself. Taking a deep breath, she finally answered, "Yes." Daniel's smile was immediate, and before she could process what had just happened, he gently took her hand. "Then it's official. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock. I'll pick you up here." Elena couldn't help but smile. "Okay." That night, as she lay in bed, Elena felt different. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to anticipate what was to come. When the next day arrived, Elena found herself feeling anxious. She chose a dress that made her feel comfortable, yet still flattered her curves. She applied light makeup, just enough to enhance her features. When the clock struck 7, Daniel appeared, as impeccable as ever, but without the formality she had expected. "You look beautiful," he said, not hiding his admiration. She smiled, feeling a pleasant warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you." He took her to a small, cozy restaurant, different from the luxurious places she had imagined he frequented. During dinner, their Conversation flowed naturally, and with each passing minute, Elena felt more connected to him. But it was when they left the restaurant and he took her to a city overlook that her heart truly raced. "I wanted to show you one of my favorite places," Daniel said, watching the illuminated city below. "I come here when I need to remind myself of what really matters." Elena looked at him, surprised. "And what really matters to you?" He turned to her and took her hand. "What's real?" he murmured. "Like you." Elena felt her breath falter as he leaned in, and this time she didn't hesitate. The kiss was different from the first, deeper, more intense. It was confirmation of everything that was happening between them, and this time, Elena knew. There was no turning back. Daniel took her to his home that night. The apartment was spacious and sophisticated, with large glass windows revealing the illuminated city. The ambiance was inviting, with modern furniture and a faint woody aroma in the air. As they entered, he pulled her back into his arms, kissing her with more urgency. Their clothes were left behind along the way to the bedroom, where they surrendered to each other without hesitation. Every touch, every sigh, every moan filled the silence of the night. Daniel explored every curve of her body with devotion, while Elena lost herself in the pleasure he made her feel. The next morning, Elena woke up wrapped in soft sheets, feeling the warmth of Daniel's body beside her. He was still asleep, his breathing steady, and she watched him for a moment, feeling something new and terrifying growing inside her. She didn't want to leave. The sun filtered through the massive windows of Daniel's apartment, gently warming Elena's skin. She slowly opened her eyes, feeling the weight of the soft sheets against her body and the comforting warmth of Daniel beside her. For a moment, she allowed herself to stay there, listening to his steady breathing, embracing the peace of that instant. But then reality set in. She had actually spent the night with him. Elena's heart raced as memories of the previous night rushed back. Every touch, every breath, every kiss exchanged seemed imprinted on her skin. The way Daniel had looked at her, as if she were the only thing in the world, left her breathless. But at the same time, it terrified her. It was all too real. Trying not to make a sound, she slid out of bed and grabbed her clothes scattered across the floor. But before she could reach the door, Daniel's husky voice stopped her. "Sneaking out?" Elena turned slowly and met his gaze, still drowsy, yet sharp. He was propped against the pillow, his hair tousled, a lazy smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not sneaking out," she replied, crossing her arms. "I just thought you might want to sleep a little longer." Daniel let out a soft chuckle and sat up, pulling the sheet around his waist. "And what if I'd rather wake up with you here?" She averted her gaze, feeling warmth creep up her face. She wasn't used to this side of him, so direct, so disarming. I need to go home, grab some clothes, get ready for work." She tried to argue. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Elena, you always have a reason to walk away. But what if, for once, you just stayed?" His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elena bit her lip, hesitating. Staying meant admitting that whatever was happening between them was real, that she was allowing herself to feel something genuine. But it also meant opening herself up to risks she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "I need to think," she murmured finally. Daniel sighed, but nodded. "Fine, think. But I really hope you stop running from me." That Saturday night, Daniel and Elena went out for a casual dinner at a charming restaurant downtown. The evening was pleasant, and the atmosphere between them was light and relaxed. Elena felt more at ease than she expected, enjoying Daniel's company without overanalyzing her fears. They dined between laughter and conversations about music, travel, and small life details that made everything feel more special. Daniel avoided discussing business or anything that might create tension between them. He just wanted to enjoy being with Elena in that moment, with no barriers. As they left the restaurant, walking hand in hand, a well-dressed couple approached them, smiling as they recognized Daniel. "Daniel Vasquez, what a surprise seeing you here," the man said, shaking his hand enthusiastically. The woman beside him smiled politely. "Good evening, Robert," Daniel greeted, keeping his usual composure. "How have you been?" "Very well. And you?" Robert asked, his gaze flickering curiously to Elena. "I see you have company tonight," before Daniel could respond. The woman at Robert's side widened her eyes in recognition. "Oh my God, you're Elena Martinez!" she exclaimed, surprised. "Ricardo Martinez's daughter, aren't you?" The air around them seemed to freeze. Daniel maintained his neutral expression, but Elena felt her whole body tense. She tried to mask her discomfort, but it was too late. Robert and his wife were already excited about the revelation. "Your father is a legend in real estate. I worked with him years ago," Robert continued, smiling. "It's amazing to see you here," Elena forced a polite smile. "Yes, my father is well known," she responded, trying not to let her voice betray her unease. Daniel, on the other hand, said nothing more than a brief smile, keeping his impeccable composure. He quickly wrapped up the conversation and bid the couple goodbye with his usual elegance, but as soon as they walked away, his expression changed entirely. Elena felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. "Daniel!" He stopped abruptly on the sidewalk, turning to face her. His eyes were intense, a mix of surprise and something deeper, something close to disappointment. "Do you want to explain what just happened?" His voice was low but filled with restrained tension. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that moment crash down on her. "Daniel, I wanted to tell you." "Wanted?" he interrupted, crossing his arms. "How long exactly were you planning to keep this from me? That you're not just a waitress, but the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the country?" She felt a knot tighten in her throat. "I never hid who I am. I just never thought it was relevant to what we were building." Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not relevant? Elena, I've spent weeks trying to understand you, intrigued by your determination, by your struggle to build something on your own. And now I find out you already come from an empire. How did you expect me to feel?" She looked at him, desperate for him to understand. "I just wanted to be myself. Not the Martinez heiress, not someone defined by my family name. I wanted to carve my own path without people treating me differently because of it." Daniel ran, a hand through his hair, clearly trying to control his emotions. "And me?" he asked, his voice quieter but heavy with meaning. "You trusted me enough to share your bed, but not enough to tell me who you really are." The question hit her like a blow. She tried to find an answer, but the truth was, he was right. She had been afraid that revealing her identity would change everything between them. But ironically, what could truly drive them apart was the fact that she had kept it a secret for so long. The silence between them was suffocating. Finally, Daniel took a deep breath and took a step back. "I need some time to process this," he said, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Elena." And without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, heartbroken, with the bitter realization that she might have just lost something she never wanted to lose. The silence in Daniel Vasquez's mansion was almost deafening. Since he had walked away from Elena that night, his mind had found no peace. He paced back and forth in his office, his thoughts spinning out of control. How could she hide something so big? How could she spend so much time by his side, sharing moments, slowly opening up, without ever mentioning that she was the heiress to one of the most powerful empires in the country? He felt deceived, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore what he felt for her. The problem wasn't the money, nor was it the last name. The problem was the lie, the omission. He sat in his leather chair, rubbing his face with his hands. He needed answers. He needed to understand. Elena, on the other hand, spent the morning in the small apartment she rented, feeling the weight of her last conversation with Daniel still pressing down on her shoulders. From the moment he walked away, her chest carried an unbearable tightness. She knew she should have told the truth, but how? From the beginning, her goal was to be recognized for her own efforts, not for the name she carried. But now, none of that seemed to matter. What hurt the most was the expression on Daniel's face when he discovered the truth. He wasn't just surprised, he was disappointed. And that hurt more than she wanted to admit. Days passed, and Daniel tried, unsuccessfully, to focus on work. But everything felt empty. Every meeting, every $1 million transaction, none of it had the same spark anymore. He could no longer fool himself. He missed Elena. He missed the way she challenged him, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams. And then he realized something that changed everything. The money had never been the problem. He himself had always hated being seen only as a wealthy businessman, a powerful man. How many times had he felt surrounded by people who only wanted what he could offer financially? How many times had he wished someone would see beyond his last name? And Elena? Elena was that person. She never treated him like a millionaire. She never tried to get close out of interest. On the contrary, she always kept a barrier between them. Not a barrier of contempt, but of protection. She wanted to be seen for who she truly was, just like he did. And now, everything made sense. Impulsive? As always, he grabbed his car keys and drove to the restaurant where Elena worked. The moment he walked in, his eyes found her instantly. She was serving a table, and when she noticed his presence, she hesitated for a second. Her heart pounded. Daniel looked different. There was no anger in his eyes, only determination. When she finished serving, he approached the counter. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm but without aggression. Elena swallowed hard and nodded. Minutes later, they were outside, where the night breeze made the air feel lighter, but not any less intense. "It took me a while to understand," he began, looking at her sincerely. "It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about your family. It was about the fact that I thought you didn't trust me enough to tell me." Elena felt her chest tighten. "Daniel, I did trust you. But I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew, you would see me differently. Afraid that everything would change. Because..." She took a deep breath, finally gathering the courage. "Because I care about you, more than I should." Daniel remained, silent for a moment, absorbing her words. His heart raced, but in a different way now. It was no longer anger. It was something much bigger. "And why would you think I care about your last name?" He took a step closer, reducing the distance between them. "Do you think I'm here because I want to be with an heiress? Do you think what drew me to you was your status? Elena, I fell for you because of who you are, because of the woman who loves what she does, who challenges expectations, who isn't afraid of hard work. I fell for the woman who smiles when she tries a new dish and who faces life head-on without needing a powerful name to define her. Your last name doesn't change anything for me, but the lie does." Elena closed her eyes for a brief second, feeling the guilt weigh even heavier. When she opened them again, she found his gaze locked on hers, filled with emotion. "I made a mistake," she whispered. "But I never wanted to hurt you." Daniel took a deep breath, and in an unexpected gesture, he held her hands in his. "I know. I'm not here to judge you, Elena. I'm here because I care too. And if there's one thing I've learned in the past few days, it's that life is too short to let something as trivial as money keep us apart. But I need to know, do you still want this? Do you want to try?" She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but smiled. a sincere smile, full of relief and hope. "Yes," she answered, without hesitation this time. And in that instant, as Daniel's eyes lit up at her response, they both knew that despite the challenges, they were exactly where they were meant to be, together. The cold night wind blew gently as Daniel and Elena stood facing each other, absorbing the intensity of the moment. After so many doubts, so many walls built and broken down, there they were, finally ready to accept what they felt. Daniel lightly squeezed Elena's hands, the warmth of her fingers contrasting with the chilly breeze around them. "So what happens now?" Elena asked, her voice low but filled with emotion. Daniel smiled, that smile she had already learned to recognize as something sincere, genuine. "Now, we find a way to make this work. No secrets, no fears, just us." He paused, searching her eyes. "Do you trust me to try?" Elena hesitated for a second, not out of doubt, but because this was real, more real than anything she had ever lived through. She took a deep breath, feeling her heart race, and finally nodded. "Yes, I trust you." The relief in Daniel's eyes was palpable. He pulled her into a firm embrace, inhaling the soft scent of her hair, the warmth of her body against his. There, in his arms, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: safety. The following days were different. Daniel returned to the restaurant, but this time their interactions were lighter, without the doubts that once haunted them. Elena still worked hard, determined to achieve her dreams without relying on the surname she carried. But now there was something new inside her, the certainty that she didn't have to carry everything alone. One quiet night, as they were closing the restaurant, Daniel waited outside for Elena. When she stepped out, he was holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, a playful smile on his lips. "Since I can never enjoy my coffee in peace while I'm in there, I thought I could make up for it now." He extended one of the cups to her. Elena took the drink, letting out a soft laugh. "So now I'm responsible for your coffee deprivation?" "Absolutely." He winked, taking a sip. They walked together to a nearby bench, sitting side by side. The city around them was calm, with only a few lights illuminating the empty streets. "Have you thought about what comes next?" Daniel asked, his voice more serious this time. Elena glanced at him, blowing softly over her cup. "Next? After this, the restaurant. What do you want for your future?" She sighed, turning to face him completely. "I've always wanted to open my own restaurant, and I still do, but I don't know when I'll be able to. It's too big of a dream for someone who started from scratch." Daniel frowned. "But you didn't start from scratch, Elena. You have talent, knowledge. Just because you don't use your family's money doesn't mean you don't have a foundation." She bit her lip, reflecting on that. He was right, but the idea of accepting help was still hard to digest. "I want to do this on my own, Daniel. I want it to be mine, so that no one can say I only made it because of my last name." He smiled, admiring her determination. "Then do it. But you don't have to do it alone." Elena frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned his elbows on his knees, turning his cup in his hands. "I know what it's like to want to prove something to yourself. I've spent my life trying to be more than just a Vasquez. But I've learned that accepting support doesn't take away anyone's merit. So if you ever need an investor who believes in you, someone who doesn't want anything in return but to see you happy, you know where to find me." She felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. He wasn't trying to buy her dream. He was offering something far more valuable: genuine support. It meant more than she could put into words. "I'll think about it." She smiled, and Daniel knew that for the first time, she was truly considering it. Months passed, and Elena worked tirelessly to turn her dream into reality. With a lot of effort and planning, she found the perfect little space for her restaurant. When she opened the doors for the first time, Daniel was her first customer. He walked into the newly decorated dining room with a proud gleam in his eyes, sitting at a table just as he always had. "So, what do you recommend today, chef?" he teased, grinning. Elena crossed her arms, pretending to think. "I think we have a customer who's a little too loyal. Maybe I should switch up the menu just to surprise him." He chuckled, but then looked at her seriously. "I'm proud of you, Elena. So much." She felt a lump form in her throat, but simply nodded, absorbing the moment. Her restaurant, her effort, her name. And beside her, someone who never tried to change her, only support her. Someone who, against all odds, loved her for who she truly was. That night, after closing, Elena and Daniel stayed alone in the restaurant. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close as the city lights flickered outside. "You did it," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We did it," she corrected, looking deep into his eyes. He smiled, and before she could say anything else, his lips met hers in a deep kiss, filled with everything they had been through to get there. It wasn't an ending. It was only the beginning of a new story. And this time, no secrets, no walls, just love.